Hello everyone. Welcome to today's show of Beneath the Broken System. This is Shabashachi Shaha, your host today, and today we're diving deep into the foundational ideas of justice and their impacts on how we see and shape our world. We're honored to be joined by a couple of distinguished guests who brings fresh, critical, and global perspectives to the ongoing debates in political philosophy. Before we get started, let me introduce today's our guests. Firstly, we have Zarif Kabir. Then I'd like to introduce you to Anika Orthi. Also, I'd like to thank Nafisa for joining today's show. And last but not the least, we also have Ahmadullah Tamim and Aisha Hayat for today's show. So let's get into this show. So firstly, I'd like to come to Zarif. So Zarif, thank you for joining today. I'd love to ask you, Zarif, how would you define injustice in the context of everyday life in Bangladesh?
Thank you for bringing me here. It's my pleasure to be here. So, before I talk about injustice in the context of everyday life in Bangladesh, let us define justice first. In general, justice is the first virtue of social institutions, akin to how truth is the first virtue of systems of thought. According to Rawls, even well-structured and efficient laws or institutions must be reformed or abolished if they are unjust, emphasizing justice's foundational primacy in societal organization. Each individual possesses an inviolability grounded in justice, which the welfare of society as a whole cannot override. Thus, justice prohibits sacrificing the freedom of some for the greater total good for others. From a more practical standpoint, Rawls insists that the principles of justice are to regulate the assignment of rights and duties and the distribution of social and economic advantages. He introduces two famous principles. The first demands equality in basic liberties for all, and the second, known as the difference principle, requires that social and economic inequalities are acceptable only if they benefit everyone and offices are open to all. Within this framework, justice is not a matter of maximizing aggregate welfare, but rather ensuring fairness and equality, reflecting a commitment to treating each person with equal moral worth. Now, injustice in Bangladesh, unfortunately, it is prevailing because, in my humble opinion, we fail to ensure fairness and equality. There is a lack of, how do I say it, there's absence of those things in Bangladesh. And honestly, it is an overcrowded country. The population is very high, third world country with political corruption. And on top of that, it makes it even harder to implement Rawls' principles. So, unfortunately, that is why injustice is prevailing in Bangladesh. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Zarif, for your answer. Now, I'd like to ask you, what role does political corruption play in maintaining systemic injustice?
So, if I talk about this, I would say, Amartya Sen in The Idea of Justice critiques the dominant tradition of political philosophy, particularly the approaches of thinkers like Rawls, for their focus on identifying perfect principles to construct perfectly just institutions. Sen calls this transcendental institutionalism and argues it is beset by two major issues, feasibility and redundancy. The feasibility problem is the practical impossibility of arriving at one set of principles that everyone would agree upon. The redundancy problem highlights how identifying spotless, perfectly just arrangements does little to help us navigate and compare real-world injustices. Sen also proposes instead a realization-focused comparative approach, shifting the emphasis from identifying ideal justice to evaluating and remedying injustices as they occur. He draws on a tradition including thinkers like Adam Smith and Mary Wollstonecraft, prioritizing the improvement of actual conditions over abstract perfection. In contrast, John Rawls' approach starts from the original position, a hypothetical scenario where principles of justice are chosen behind a veil of ignorance to ensure impartiality. Rawls' theory, justice as fairness, provides two principles to regulate society: equal basic liberties for all and social economic inequalities only when they benefit everyone and offices are open to all. Rawls' theory, as presented in quote-unquote A Theory of Justice, focuses on the design of just institutions based on hypothetical ideal agreement, while Sen calls for practical engagement with actual injustices and open public reasoning to guide reform.
Oh, thank you so much, Zarif. That was really a wonderful answer. I hope our audience will understand from your answer. Now, I would also like to ask you, how does social class affect access to legal protection and opportunities in Bangladesh?
That's a good question. I would say the role of equality in political philosophy and specifically in Rawls' and Sen's work has been central yet contested. John Rawls, in quote-unquote A Theory of Justice, asserts that justice demands fundamental equality in the assignment of basic rights and duties. In his view, justice requires that each person has an equal right to the most extensive liberties compatible with similar liberties for others, and that social and economic inequalities are only justified if they benefit everyone and offices are equally accessible. Rawls' theory is ultimately egalitarian. It means differences in wealth, power, or status can exist only if they serve to improve the positions of the least advantaged and everyone is given genuine equality of opportunity. Rawls also distinguishes between justice as fairness and strict equality, noting that while some inequalities can be permitted, they must always serve the greater equalization of prospects for all. The quote-unquote difference principle is Rawls' mechanism for readdress. Society must compensate for undeserved inequalities by actively favoring those who begin at a disadvantage, thus readdressing the bias of contingencies in the direction of equality. The basis of equality in Rawls' work comes from the concept of moral personality. Everyone capable of a sense of justice and a conception of the good is owed equal rights and full protection of justice. Amartya Sen, on the other hand, emphasizes the diversity and pluralism of impartial principles of equality. He critiques traditional theories for seeking a unique, abstract set of perfectly just principles and instead highlights the importance of making comparative judgments between real situations of advantage and disadvantage. Sen's vision of equality is thus more practical and rooted in remedying visible injustices rather than aspiring to an unreachable theoretical perfection. Sen advocates what he calls an open impartiality that is more attuned to diverse perspectives, moving away from the idealized equality of Rawls' quote-unquote closed impartiality. Sen argues for using public reasoning and comparative approaches to achieve a more meaningful realization of equality in society. So that's my take on this issue.
Well, thank you so much, Zarif. That's really a wonderful answer. Okay, now I'd like to ask you, Anika, that Amartya Sen critiques Rawls' focus on ideal justice. How can we apply Sen's comparative approach to understand injustices in Bangladesh?
Thank you for inviting me here. So Amartya Sen challenges John Rawls' idea of justice as something perfect and ideal, which he calls transcendental institutionalism. Sen argues that the kind of thinking is both unrealistic and unnecessary. Instead, he suggests a more grounded, practical approach, one that compares real-world options and looks for ways to make people's life better step by step, rather than aiming for some imagined perfect system. Take Bangladesh as an example. Suppose we are looking at two healthcare policies aimed at helping rural communities. Policy A plans to build clinics, something more focused on institutions and long-term ideals. Policy B, on the other hand, focuses on mobile clinics, local health workers, and making medicines more affordable, a more practical, immediate solution. Senate tell us not to ask which policy is ideally best, but which one does a better job of reducing injustice right now. This way of thinking is especially useful when we look at Bangladesh's urban health problems, like those in slum areas. These communities often face poor planning, weak institutions, and bad coordination. Instead of chasing some perfect healthcare system, Sen's approach helps us focus on which policy brings real improvements now and which one makes life a little less unfair for the people who need help the most.
Okay, thank you so much, Anika, for your answer. Now, I'd like to also ask you, Mills argues that Western political philosophy ignores colonial and racial history. How do colonial legacies impact justice in Bangladesh?
So Charles William Mills points out that Western political thought often overlooks how deeply it tied to colonialism. As a result, it builds a moral and political framework that ignores the experiences of marginalized groups. In Bangladesh, we can clearly see this in our criminal justice system. Many of the laws we still use, like the Penal Code of 1860, the Police Act of 1861, the Evidence Act of 1872, and the Criminal Procedure Code of 1898. Were created during colonial rule and haven't changed much since. These laws promote a justice system that's harsh, top-down, and more focused on punishment than fairness. This kind of system is often described as isomorphic mimicry, where we copy the outward structure of Western justice but don't actually deliver justice, especially for the poor, women, or who challenges authority. Mill's perspective urges us to look deeper and ask, is our justice system really working for everyone? Or is it still reinforcing the power structures left behind by colonialism? Instead of chasing idealist model, we need an approach that honestly faces our history, recognizes inequalities baked into the system, and works to break them down.
Thank you so much, Anika. So, I also have a question to you. That is, Rawls proposes the veil of ignorance for impartial judgment. If applied to Bangladesh, would current policies still seem just?
Okay, so John Rawls' idea of the veil of ignorance asks us to imagine designing a just society without knowing who will be in it, whether rich or poor. From the society or countryside, part of the majority or a minority. Now let's apply that to Bangladesh, specifically to the urban health policies. If I don't know my background or status, would I support a system where urban poor communities often have worse health outcomes than those in rural areas? Probably not. This raises real concerns about whether our policies are truly fair, but critiques of Rawls point out that his thought experiment can feel too removed from reality. It does not always take into account our complex identities, cultural backgrounds, or deep-rooted inequalities that shapes our lives. For many people, the idea of completely setting aside their social position does not seem realistic. Even so, the veil of ignorance gives us a valuable principle to work with. No one should be disadvantaged just because of where they were born or who they are. If policymakers use this lens, they had be pushed to ask whether current systems actually protect basic rights and create equal opportunities, or if they continue to benefit certain groups at the expense of others.
Thank you so much for your answer. Now, Nafisa, I'd like to ask you, drawing on roles theory, do you think the basic structure of Bangladeshi society distributes rights and duties fairly?
Well, thank you. John Rawls argues that a just society must guarantee equal basic rights for all and only allow inequalities if they benefit the least advantaged. The basic structure of society, meaning its legal, political, and economical institutions, play the main role in distributing these rights and duties fairly. In Bangladesh, the basic structure often fails to meet this standard. The Dhaka Tribune 2025 reported that victims of the July 2024 violence are still waiting for justice. While ordinary citizens continue to bear the burden of insecurity and legal cost, politically connected actors avoid accountability. This shows that rights and duties are not applied equally across society. Similarly, Khan 2014 presents life story of women for marginalized communities who face structural violence. They suffer from poverty, lack of access to education, social discrimination. These advantages are not based on merit but on the unfair design of social institutions. From Rawls' point of view, this is unjust because rights like legal protection, freedom from violence, and access to opportunities should be granted equally. Yet in Bangladesh, class, gender, and political connection determine whether a person enjoys the rights. Duties are also unfairly distributed. Ordinary people pay taxes through VAT and face strict law enforcement, while the wealthy often evade taxes and escape legal responsibilities. Thus, the basic structure of Bangladeshi society does not distribute rights and duties fairly.
Okay, thank you. Now, can you specify any examples where economic injustice is perpetuated by government policies or business practices in Bangladesh?
Well, there are several examples of how policies and business practice in Bangladesh reinforce economic justice. The Dhaka Tribune 2025 shows that victims of political violence did not receive compensations or protection. This reflects a wider pattern. Poor citizens bear the cost of violence and instability, while elites remain untouched. Economic injustice is also seen in how indirect taxes such as VAT place a heavier burden on the poor, while the rich benefit from tax breaks or evade taxes. Khan 2014 provides further evidence by showing how marginalized women are denied access to education, healthcare, and fair employment. These women, including tea workers and sex workers, face exploitation that is reinforced by government neglect and business interests. Their lack of opportunity is not natural but created by structural policies that favor elites. Another example comes from Transparency International Bangladesh 2023, which reports that corruption in land administration and public allows elite to seize resources while the poor lose out. Bank loan default also show how big business owners escape punishment while small borrowers face strict penalties. In Rawls' framework, this inequality cannot be justified because they do not benefit the least advantaged. Both government policies and business practice often perpetuate economic injustice in Bangladesh. This injustice reflects systematic failures where the rules are designed to protect the powerful rather than the uplift the weak.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, what cultural values in Bangladesh potentially support or discourage a just society?
Well, cultural values play a powerful role in shaping injustice in Bangladesh. Some values support fairness while others discourage. On the positive side, Bangladeshi society has a strong tradition of community solidarity. In village and neighborhoods, people often help one another during floods, cyclone, or personal crisis. This spirit of cooperation reflects Rawls' idea that social cooperation should benefit everyone. Religious values also encourage justice. For example, Islam emphasizes zakat and caring for the poor, while aligns with Rawls' difference principle, where inequalities should improve the situation for the least advantaged. However, other culture practice discourage justice. Patriarchy is one of the strongest barriers. Women are often excluded from decision making and face systematic barriers in education, employment, and safety. Khan 2014 shows how women from marginalized groups are trapped in cycles of poverty and abuse because of culture and institutional discrimination. Another discouraging factor is corruption. Political loyalty or family influence often matters more than merit in getting jobs, justice, or service. This violates Rawls' principle of fair equality of opportunity. Rawls help us Sen argues that instead of waiting for a perfect system, we should focus on reducing visible injustice. In Bangladesh, culture values like compassion and solidarity can be used to fight against patriarchy and corruption. By promoting these positive values, Bangladesh can move toward a more just society even if perfection is not possible.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nafsa. Now I would like to invite Mr. Ahmadullah. Mr. Ahmadullah, thank you so much for your time today. So I'd like to ask you, what are the most visible forms of institutional injustice experienced by ethnic and religious minorities in Bangladesh?
Thank you, Shabbashaji. When we consider the issue of injustice in Bangladesh, the treatment of ethnic and religious minorities by our institutions is one of the most evident examples of it. Take the Chittagong Hill Tracts. Tribal communities like Chakma and Shawtal still opposed land grabbing, displacement, and despite signing a peace accord in 1997, rather defend them, local authorities or police would usually oppose those who are stronger. In Economic and Political Weekly in 2018, Borua Chakma termed this as a breakdown of peace-building injustice, not just in individual disputes but within the institutions themselves. The same is true of religious minorities. A 2016 study by Professor Sofia Uddin reveals that Hindus and Christians feel sidelined during employment by the government and are not well placed to receive equal treatment when they need a lawyer to defend them. Not that there are no laws in Bangladesh, but that there is unequal application of laws depending on who you are. In political philosophy, justice, according to John Rawls, is the first virtue of social institution. However, that virtue is lacking here when institutions fail to treat minorities as equal citizens. Amartya Sen's The Idea of Justice, 2009, leaves no doubt about it. We do not need an ideal definition of justice to realize that land dispossession and exclusion are unfair when weighed against more equal options. What are the most obvious injustices then? Land loss, under representation, and non-equal protection. These realities that are experienced in day-to-day lives of minority groups and Our institution also must guard this weak, not strong, in order to be just.
Thank you, Ahmadullah, for your answer. Now, how do people in rural areas experience justice differently compared to urban populations?
So, justice in Bangladesh is not the same thing in a rural village and a city such as Dhaka. To the rural person, the courts are far, extremely costly and painfully slow. Due to this, the Shalish or local mediation councils are dependent on many villagers. Not only are they able to solve conflicts within a short duration of time, but they also tend to be dominated by local elites. Writing in the Asian Journal of Law and Society in 2017, Muhammad Rahman clarified that this often leads to decision in favor of rich or powerful, not the weaker party. Citing the land disputes, a poor farmer will virtually always lose to a landlord, not because of the law, but due to the bias. City dwellers have different problems: labor right, insecure houses, traffic law, etc. At least they are more in touch with formal courts, lawyers and the media. Their struggles can be more visible because of the closeness and can sometimes receive quicker reaction. Instead, rural injustice tends to hide at national level. John Rawls believed that justice must be equally safeguarded by just institutions, but in the real world, geography itself generates inequality. Where you live determine how much justice you are allowed. Amartya Sen would refer to this as a comparative injustice, as the difference between what rural folks get and what they rightfully deserve is too broad. In Bangladesh, then, there is no even-handed justice. The rural-urban divide creates a structural inequality, and unless institutions are modified to address the needs of rural citizens, there will not be an equal promise of justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ahmadullah, for your answer. Okay, unfortunately, we're actually running out of time. Unfortunately, I have to make the session shorter. So now I'd like to welcome Aisha. Thank you, Aisha, for your time today. I'd like to ask you, how does media coverage affect public understanding and action on social injustice?
Well, media really shapes how people see injustice. Sometimes it gives space to marginalized voices, but other times it silences them. For example, Paul et al. Studied how indigenous people are shown in Bangladeshi media. They found the coverage often use stereotypes instead of focusing on their real struggles. This makes the public think the issues are less serious. Also, under laws like the Digital Security Act, many journalists cannot freely report, but that accountability and stops people from taking action. But social media has changed things too. Abir et al. Showed that during the monsoon uprising, Facebook posts and memes help people unite and resist. Still, Rashid warns that social media is also full of toxic speech which can divide people. From theory, Rawls said public discussion should give equal voice to everyone. Mills reminded us that in history, marginalized voices were excluded. So in the end, media can be a tool for justice or for silencing, depending on who controls it and how it's used.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Aisha. Thank you, all our distinguished guests. I express my gratitude to you as you have make your time. And now let's talk about how the media impacts our understanding of social injustice. Well, what do you think? Does it actually help or sometimes make things worse?
Media is powerful. It shapes how we see injustice. At times, it really highlights problems and gives a voice to people on the margins. but other times it can actually shut those voices down.
Yeah, I agree with you, Zarif. I also have noticed that too. Sometimes coverage is more about stereotypes than real stories.
Exactly. Paul and colleagues did a study last year looking at how indigenous groups are covered in Bangladeshi media. Instead of digging into their real struggles, the media relied on narrow stereotypes that makes the public feel like these issues aren't very serious, which is a real problem.
And these silences are made worse by laws, right?
Well, definitely. With laws like the Digital Security Act, many journalists feel that they can report freely. For example, we can take the Dhaka Tribune found this year, accountability suffers and people don't step up to take action when they don't feel informed or empowered.
Well, I agree with you, Nafisa. And social media seems to be changing the game a bit though. What do you think, Ahmadullah?
Thank you, Shabashaji. It has, to some extent. During the monsoon uprising, Abir and their team found that memes and posts on Facebook helped people unite and force back. But as Rashid pointed out, it's also a place for toxic conversation. Sometimes that divides us more.
So it sounds like media can either build bridges or walls.
Yes, Rawls said everyone deserves unequal voices in public discussions. But Mills reminds us that historically those most affected by injustice were the ones left out.
Oh, that's a great point. Well, at the end, media can help the fight for justice or make it harder, depending on who's telling the story and who gets to be heard.
Exactly. It's all about control and inclusion.
We're almost at the end of our show. So today, the questions we explored throughout our discussion of justice, equality, and boundaries of political philosophy demand deep reflection and humanity. Philosophers like Rawls have challenged us to design principles from behind a veil of ignorance, imagining what fair cooperation would look like for all rational, moral persons, regardless of their luck or social position. Meanwhile, Amartya Sen urges us to step away from the quest for a perfectly just blueprint. He asks us instead to focus on practical comparisons and real progress to repair today's injustices through public reasoning, open impartiality, and the constant search for betterment in the world we share. In this journey, our duty is not only to seek fairness for ourselves, but to listen, challenge, and include those whom history has forgotten or marginalized. In the spirit of openness, curiosity, and humanity, let us continue our pursuit of a more just world for everyone, everywhere. So I'd like to conclude the session today as we're running out of time. So thank you, distinguished guests, for your valuable time and your valuable answer. Once again, thank you so much, guys, for joining us today. Thank you. Have a good day. Goodbye.